You're the most successful, best performing stock in the world last year.
The decision to adopt Bitcoin as our core treasury asset has been an absolute game changer for us over the past year. During the depths of despair, when I was running my hotel business, I was comforted by listening to some podcasts that Michael Saylor was on. And
this is the dilemma that I was thinking about.
The fact that governments can just print them at will, and all the hard work that you put in can be printed at will.
A lot of people see this playbook and be like, I want to just copy this. They're like, this is like a cheat sheet. So a lot of people come in, their heart is not in the right place, right? But they claim that they're Bitcoin companies.
I have a view perhaps in public and another one in private.
I want the one in private.
We're in the first part of this Bitcoin journey. This is phase one. In phase one, we're in a gold rush. During the gold rush, we want to secure as much Bitcoin as we can of the Bitcoin network. It's only 21 million. But then in phase two, when
is stage two?
We're joined today by Simon Gerovich, president of Metaplanet. We're talking about the future of treasury holdings for Bitcoin and the future of hospitality linking with Bitcoin. Bonnie Channing is joining us today. She's the host of Bonnie Blockchain. Welcome to the show, Simon.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
The latest news that came in today, Metaplanet has reached almost 600K per coin in Bitcoin Premium. And the article says that is way too high. Do you think MNAV is a good metric for a Bitcoin treasury company?
Well, there's lots of KPIs that have been recently adopted. BTC yield, I think, is perhaps the most important one. Tells you about your Bitcoin per share and how quickly it's growing. It's something that Saylor adopted. And Bitcoin treasury companies now around the world are doing the same. So I think one needs to look at various metrics when they think about how a company ought to be valued. Now, MNAV is your multiple, your market cap, plus your debt, enterprise value divided by your Bitcoin holdings. And that's something that will ebb and flow with kind of interest in your stock and the activities that you engage in. So I think there's lots of reasons for why a company should have a premium to its NAV. And that for us, I think how our flywheel began a year ago was that because the taxation is very different for those who want to buy Bitcoin directly. If you're a Japanese retail investor, you have to pay up to 55% as personal income tax, or you can buy a listed wrapper, a company like Metaplanet that gives exposure in a tax-efficient manner. And so that started our flywheel. And I think what justifies an MNAV really are numerous things. And most importantly, I think it's your ability to increase your Bitcoin per share. So we're one of the fastest growing companies in the world now in terms of growing our Bitcoin per share. And, MNAV is something which we're very much focused on kind of maintaining, between sort of 3 to 5. We don't want to be selling shares aggressively and pushing the stock down. But at the same time, it's a really great way for us to increase Bitcoin per share on behalf of all of our shareholders.
I think in one of your interviews, you said the Japanese market, if they want Bitcoin exposure, they kind of have to go through you, right? Or is it?
Well, there's various choices. So one can just go to a local exchange and buy Bitcoin.
Of course.
But the problem there is that they're exposed to the tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when people realize they would like exposure in a tax-efficient manner and in a way where they're able to outperform Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, obviously, if you just buy Bitcoin, your performance will be Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. If you're in the US and you buy an ETF, your performance, by virtue of an ETF, being aligned to the price of Bitcoin will never outperform Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. But the beauty of a Bitcoin treasury company, a company that is an operating company that can utilize, all the capital market tools available, equity issuances, in time convert issuances, pref equity issuances, that's how you can actually increase your Bitcoin per share.
And there are 3 metrics: Bitcoin per share, BTC dollar gain, and BTC gain. What are the differences?
So BTC yield is the change in Bitcoin per share from one period to another. Mm-hmm. And so our BTC yield so far this year is about 190%. So we've increased our Bitcoin per share by 190%, basically almost tripling our Bitcoin per share. Now BTC gain takes BTC yield and puts it in kind of an absolute Bitcoin sense. So the math is taking your Bitcoin holdings at the end of the last period and you multiply by your BTC yield. And so for us this year, I think it's around 3,500 Bitcoin that we have generated through our Bitcoin treasury operations after considering dilution. And then take that 3,500 Bitcoin, multiply it by the Bitcoin price, that gives you BTC dollar gain.
Mm-hmm.
So it really converts into, I suppose, a way for the traditional market to understand, how much value is being created under the hood. And so for us, our BTC dollar gain this year is about $400 million. And I like to think about that as sort of like a profit number. It isn't really profit, but it does show the underlying value that's being created. And so take $400 million, annualize that, for the rest of the year, that could be $1 billion of BTC gain.
Wow.
And so what is a company worth that can generate $1 billion of value on behalf of all shareholders on an annual basis? And so I think, the challenge right now is that traditional finance has limited tools to value companies. They look at things in, the box which they've been given, but Bitcoin treasury companies can't be looked at in the same way, right? We don't have substantial revenue to speak of. We don't have, earnings really to speak of in the traditional sense, like an operating company. And so one must look at other tools, and BTC yield, BTC gain, BTC dollar gain are some of those tools that I think companies will be adopting, and analysts will be able to look at that and understand what's happening.
Before we get your philosophy on Bitcoin itself, which I find very interesting, you probably have some interesting views on that as well. Let's talk about your company, Metaplanet. It's been compared to MicroStrategy. In fact, it's been dubbed the MicroStrategy of Asia. How would you respond to that comparison?
Very honored and humbled by that comparison. Michael Saylor has been a huge inspiration. I often share that during COVID, during the depths of despair, when I was running my hotel business, I was comforted by listening to some podcasts that Michael Saylor was on, and just sharing with everyone, sharing with the world his vision on how a listed company can pivot and embrace Bitcoin in a way that wasn't possible in the past. And so that really gave me the inspiration to pivot out of the hotel business, which was already struggling. So there wasn't really much of a choice, but there were many directions that we could have taken. And the decision to adopt Bitcoin as our core treasury asset has been an absolute game changer for us over the past year.
You must have reached some resistance amongst your investors initially when you wanted to start this pivot, objections to holding any asset besides your core business, especially something as new and novel as Bitcoin. How did you overcome these objections? Or
what was the conversation like at the meeting?
Yeah. I want to say it's a blessing in disguise that we weren't performing very well. It's just, it's sad to say, but we were a company that was struggling. We had no choice but to pivot. The board and the shareholders at that time, said to me, Simon, think of anything that can save the company. And so it wasn't like we had a very difficult board meeting and there were directors that were against the idea. But I am brought back to years ago when the company was doing fine. And I proposed to the board that we should accept Bitcoin at our hotels. It seems like a very simple thing to do, a very easy kind of next step. But I was kind of laughed out of the boardroom at that point, saying, why would we risk our business with something as undesirable as Bitcoin? And so, gave it up because there was really no choice.
Yeah.
But I did think in the future, would there be an opportunity for us to be able to bring Bitcoin back into our core business, and we were able to do that at the right time.
Just based on what you just said, this is the dilemma that I was thinking about. So you have healthy companies with healthy cash flow and unhealthy company that are struggling. Now, the unhealthy company might turn themselves into Bitcoin treasury company because I have nothing to lose, and the upside is huge. Now, after they do that, the stock price shoot up and they outperform the larger company with healthy cash flow. How does this end?
Well, I think the amazing thing is Bitcoin treasury companies are finding a way to give exposure to investors who otherwise may have found it difficult to get exposure. Everyone has a securities account. They're able to buy stocks and they're familiar buying stocks. but there's an extra step requiring people to open up a crypto exchange account. And, there's been numerous hacks in the past. And I think some people who perhaps concerned about that aspect of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies get put off. And then you have, the traditional investors that just can't buy Bitcoin. Their funds don't allow them to do so, but they can buy listed equities. And so I think this wonderful innovation of a Bitcoin treasury company is a game changer. It's a black hole of capital. It's a tidal wave of capital that will be flowing into Bitcoin thanks to Bitcoin treasury companies. Of course, one, I think, needs to be very careful about which Bitcoin treasury company they select. Track record, I think, will be increasingly important. We have the benefit now of a long track record of 14 months, and Strategy has a long track record now of 5 years. And it's important, what the CEO says. Are they a Bitcoiner? Do they believe in Bitcoin? Are they ever going to sell their Bitcoin? I'm reminded of, I went to this conference in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago, CLSA conference. They do a conference focused on Japanese equities. And in the crowd, someone asked me a question and said, what else are you going to buy besides Bitcoin? And I apparently had this really disgusted look on my face, which people captured and shared on social media. But no one should ever doubt that Metaplanet would buy anything other than Bitcoin. We'll only ever buy Bitcoin. We'll never sell our Bitcoin. And that message is also very clear from Michael Saylor. And so I think if you're investing in a Bitcoin treasury company, it needs to be fully in and never sell and do everything they can to accumulate more.
Could you show that face?
It was like...
Again. Love it.
She does a good impression of that face as well, but,
right.
Offline usually. Right. Usually when I'm talking to her, annoying. But
show it to us.
That's exactly the face she makes when I talk to her. Simon, can you tell us about the initial stages of this pivot? You said you were a struggling hospitality company. How did you finance the acquisition of Bitcoin initially, and how did the financing, evolve over the last couple of years?
Sure. So we had a series of hotels, and during that initial meeting, when we discussed moving into Bitcoin, we made the decision to sell hotels. So a lot of the sale from the hotels, that gave us the initial capital. We also raised capital from some like-minded investors at that time. And some of the investors are at this conference. And so UTXO Management, the sponsors of the Bitcoin conference, they became one of our early shareholders. And we've got a tremendous board. And a lot of the board members who joined us also invested in that effectively private placement at that time. So we bought our initial round of Bitcoin at the beginning of last year. And then we proceeded to do a rights issue. And a rights issue is, as you're familiar, you buy, the company offers new shares for existing shareholders to purchase. And so for every share that was outstanding, we offered one new share for existing shareholders to purchase. And traditionally, a rights issue is perceived very negatively. A company that does a rights issue is struggling. They need to raise capital on an urgent basis to survive. But in retrospect, it was the best thing we could have done. We had 14,000 shareholders fill out a huge stack of documents to give us money to buy Bitcoin. And that created, I think, the initial connection between our Japanese shareholders and the company, because they gave us the money that we used to buy Bitcoin. If you go into the market now and buy shares of any company, you're buying shares from someone else who is selling. But when you subscribe for new shares, that cash comes into the company, and you think as a shareholder, wow, that's my money going towards the company buying Bitcoin. And so we did that. That was last summer. We raised, I believe, around 60, 70 million US dollars at that time. And then we proceeded at the end of the year to issue our first moving strike warrant. And the moving strike warrant is Japan's answer to the US at-the-money equity offering. And so in the US, it's very straightforward for a company to sell new shares directly into the market, which is what Strategy is doing. But that isn't possible for us in Japan. And so we have a moving strike warrant structure that's issued to a partner who then effectively sells shares in the market, uses the cash to exercise the warrants, and they get new shares issued, which they return. The ultimate result is exactly the same, but we've managed to raise a lot of capital by using the moving strike warrant. And so we did one in December, and then our most recent one, which we launched in February, just closed, just finished exercising last week. We announced accordingly, and we raised about $600 million of equity. And so the pace of capital raising now is really speeding up. And the larger you get, the more shares you can issue and the more Bitcoin you can buy. And so we plan to continue with the kind of the at the money equivalent. And then in time, again, strategy has made it very clear for everyone what the playbook is.
Yes.
And so we can issue converts perhaps in the future. We can issue preferred equity perhaps in the future. But right now, we're very much focused on our equity phase. That's the most efficient. That's permanent capital you never have to repay. And we can buy Bitcoin with that.
Back to what you were talking about, obviously, Michael Saylor and you guys are Bitcoiners, and the company, Bitcoin treasury companies, are supported by all Bitcoiners. Now, a lot of people see this playbook and be like, I want to just copy this. This is what you're the most successful, best performing stock in the world last year, right? They're like, oh, this is like a cheat sheet. So a lot of people come in, their heart is not in the right place, right? But they claim that they're Bitcoin companies. What is your view on that?
Well, I have a view perhaps in public and another one in private.
I want the one in private.
Given this is a public channel, I would say high level, it's great that more companies are adopting a Bitcoin standard. I think that should apply not just to struggling companies like ours was, but successful companies that have a lot of cash sitting there doing nothing.
Yes.
Now, there's always going to be bad players that see this as a quick get-rich-quick scheme. And they may say, okay, if Bitcoin is something that can make my stock price go up, then why should I not do the same? I think investors are smart. And as more and more Bitcoin treasury companies appear, it'll be easier for investors to be able to compare and contrast. And there are quite a few platforms that I've seen now that do a really good job of monitoring all the different Bitcoin treasury companies on a BTC yield basis and Bitcoin per share basis, et cetera. And so it'll come out in the wash, right? The companies that execute and that are focused and disciplined, they will command a greater premium than those that don't. I've seen a company recently, announcing that they sold their Bitcoin. I thought to myself, that's a bit silly. They wanted to book some profit in the last quarter, and they announced, months ago that they were buying Bitcoin. And now, if you start to sell your Bitcoin, then you lose credibility. People aren't going to buy you as a way to get exposure to more and more Bitcoin over time. And so I think there will be some differentiation over time, and it'll be clear for investors which ones they want to back for specific reasons. But yes, I think there are various motives that exist for people as they look to buy Bitcoin on their balance sheet.
Is there a price of Bitcoin at which you would stop buying or acquiring Bitcoin, or at least slow down the acquisition of Bitcoin?
Absolutely not. I think the Bitcoin...
So if it goes to
go up forever, David.
500K next week, you would buy more and ignore the 5x appreciation over, in this hypothetical example, 1 week.
I love your hypothetical example. What if Bitcoin went to $1 trillion by tomorrow? Well, then one must think perhaps that's overvalued in that moment. We plan to keep buying Bitcoin forever. Again, Michael Saylor likes to say that he wants to buy the top all the time. We're competing with him to buy that top. But as we know today, we're kind of at all-time highs again, and Bitcoin is a very special asset that has interesting supply and demand mechanics, and Bitcoin is something that's going to continue to go up over time as more and more of the world takes notice. Now, if your question was when we're going to sell our Bitcoin, again, that's never. We want our shareholders to make the decision when they'd like to buy and sell our shares. We want to be a perfect leveraged proxy for Bitcoin. And the best thing that we can do is remain focused and disciplined and not change that plan, not make people wonder or be concerned if something happens in the markets that will suddenly change our kind of perspective or point of view.
You know how Michael talks about MSTR is 1.5x leveraged Bitcoin. Now, a lot of investors, they assume that when Bitcoin hits all-time high, MSTR or other Bitcoin treasury companies should also hit all-time high. Why is it not the case?
We hit all-time high.
Not you, but like other companies?
I think it's important to maintain a long-term view. And so in the case of strategy, the share price today is maybe where it was 4 or 5 months ago. But the big difference is they have significantly more Bitcoin per share. The company is significantly more valuable today, even if the share price may not reflect that.
Right. But what I'm saying is the public, they don't really understand Bitcoin per share. Like, how should they look at it? Let's say you're talking to my grandma who's 70, 80 years old. How do you break it down to her?
Well, if your grandma's 70 or 80 years old, I guess I can't say take a long-term view, but she can take a long-term view for her kids and for you, etc. It is, we're in the first part of this Bitcoin journey. This is phase 1. And phase 1, we're in a gold rush. During the gold rush, we want to secure as much Bitcoin as we can of the Bitcoin network. There's only 21 million, and Strategy now has more Bitcoin than any other public company. It will be very difficult for anyone to catch up. We'd like to be a firm number 2. But then in phase 2, when Bitcoin price is significantly higher, I think that is when the price will begin to really reflect in a lot of these public companies. And so there's supply-demand mechanics. There's Bitcoin price is very volatile. The stocks are volatile. Companies are executing their fundraising. During this phase, one just needs to realize that the stock price may not necessarily reflect the underlying value. The case of companies like Amazon, right? It underperformed for a long, long time as the company was growing. People knew how much revenue was rising in the company, but they were too focused on profit, and there wasn't much profit in the early days because everything was being reinvested into advertising and marketing and growing the network. And so I think anyone who buys a Bitcoin treasury company should not be doing it on a very short-term basis. In the same way that if you buy Bitcoin, you also shouldn't be looking at it on a very short-term basis. But the medium to long-term Bitcoin treasury companies will absolutely outperform Bitcoin because they have this ability to grow their Bitcoin per share. You buy shares of the Bitcoin treasury company, you let the companies do the hard work. They're doing the Bitcoin treasury operations, they're increasing Bitcoin per share, and then you wake up again a year, 2, 3, 5 from now, and all of a sudden your exposure to Bitcoin is that much more.
How much of domestic currency performance, how much does that impact your new strategy for acquiring Bitcoin? So as you know, the yen has been depreciating versus the dollar and other currency baskets over the last 15, 20 years. Had that not been the case, would you have still made this pivot?
Absolutely. I think Bitcoin is this apex monetary asset that is, it's you can't. There's nothing else out there that is as compelling. If you're in a market though where the currency is declining, I mean, the U.S. is a prime example. A lot of people talk about the U.S. and the money printing and the debt burden that the country is under. Japan is quite similar. A lot of the G7 nations are exactly the same. So Japan is the most indebted nation as a percentage of GDP, and it's significant. And people's purchasing power of the yen has declined significantly. Most people who proudly could go to Hawaii on vacation now can't go anymore because the yen has weakened substantially. But I don't think this is a comment necessarily on the yen or the dollar. It's just fiat currencies. The fact that governments can just print them at will, right? All the hard work that you put in can be printed at will. Yeah, isn't the best long-term store of value.
Just a quick follow-up. So the understanding that Bitcoin protects against inflation is well understood.
Yes.
How about deflation? So as you know, Japan has experienced deflation throughout the 2000s and late 90s after the real estate crash. If the purchasing power of my cash were to increase over time, which is what deflation is, what then is the thesis or need for something like Bitcoin in that environment?
Very, very esoteric. Prices have begun to rise again.
Sure.
I think we had an incredible, asset bubble in Japan, fueled by reconstruction after the war. And so Japan, I remember when I was living there in the 80s, that Japan, people writing books about Japan being number one. I do hope Japan, returns to that position at some point. It was really prices declining from an absolute incredible peak. Mm-hmm. Inflation has returned. But I suppose if you're in an environment where the value of your money goes up over time, in sort of a deflationary environment, then maybe it's less obvious to buy something like Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is just, it's finite in a way that even a currency which is appreciating is not going to see in the same way. So Bitcoin can stand on its own, and compared to the money printing and the inflation that we're seeing around the globe, again, there isn't a better thing that you can purchase to store your value.
Having that much Bitcoin, right? How do you protect the Bitcoin?
That's, I think, one of the reasons why a Bitcoin treasury company is interesting is that it removes a lot of the hurdles to own Bitcoin. And as we shared earlier, it's, if you can lose your private keys and you lose your Bitcoin, it's not the same as calling up your bank when you've got your password and you get your money back. It's something that's fine. It's final. You never get it back. And so if you invest in a Bitcoin treasury company, or even invest in an ETF, you can sleep better at night knowing that it's still going to be there in the morning. A lot of Bitcoiners, they haven't told their wives or their husbands or their children about their private keys, and if they, God forbid, pass away, then again their Bitcoin may be gone forever. And so, as a company ourselves, we're very much focused on transparency. We publish all of our public addresses. It's on our dashboard. We think for us that's incredibly important to gain the trust of the investment community and our shareholders. In Japan, we're required by law to custody our Bitcoin with licensed third-party custodians. And so that's what we do. And as we acquire more Bitcoin, we're adding more custodians to the list. And so we want to make sure that our Bitcoin is secure, best-in-class custodians, and distributed across any number of custodians at any one time.
Back to David's question earlier, if a company says, I'm a Bitcoin treasury company, but they trade, let's say they buy low and sell high, and they're so good at this, how does that destroy this whole system that works beautifully? Like Michael Saylor came up with this playbook, like you said, but if I ever sell my Bitcoin, except for my investors being very disappointed, what else is going to happen?
You're not really a Bitcoin treasury company. I think if you're trading your Bitcoin, you could be a Bitcoin hedge fund, and there's plenty of investment vehicles that give you exposure to that. I know there are vehicles that earn a yield, on various trading strategies that relate to Bitcoin, but that's different fundamentally to a Bitcoin treasury company. We need to increase our Bitcoin per share over time, and that's done by constantly accumulating Bitcoin and not selling it.
And earlier you said we are at stage 1, right? This is the Wild West. This is the gold rush. And we should wait for stage 2. When is stage 2?
Stage 2 is probably maybe 3 to 5 years from now, maybe 5 to 7 years from now. It's a time when there's, massive Bitcoin adoption around the globe. Bitcoin prices north of $1 million, maybe it's $5 million. It's at a time when, banks are properly custodying Bitcoin. And so now if you own treasuries, you own a stock portfolio, if you own real estate, you can deposit that with a bank and they'll lend you money against it. Right now, it's not so possible to do that in the Bitcoin space. And I know many banks now finally said we're going to custody Bitcoin, but time will tell when they actually do and offer you an interest rate against your Bitcoin that's attractive. But in phase 2, people will be able to use this pristine balance sheet of Bitcoin. I hope we'll have trillions of dollars of Bitcoin on our balance sheet, and we'll be able to deposit that with, a major bank, and they'll lend us money cheaply, and we can use that cash to then acquire businesses that are, in our case, focused on the Bitcoin ecosystem. It could be getting a digital banking license or buying a regional bank and, offering Bitcoin-related services to our customers. But it's incredibly exciting in that second phase, because in that second phase there is so much that one can do with, pristine Bitcoin on their balance sheets.
Why aren't hotels accepting their room charges in Bitcoin right now? And would that change?
Would you spend your Bitcoin?
If I'm being paid in Bitcoin and it becomes a currency, bang.
I wouldn't.
One night.
I wouldn't spend my Bitcoin.
Why not?
What?
The Bitcoin pizza story.
Yeah.
You end up paying for a room and Bitcoin goes to $1 million. It was a very expensive room you paid for.
Yeah.
That's in hindsight, but you don't know what's going to happen to the price tomorrow. Is that why people don't use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange universally right now? Because everyone has this belief?
You probably want to spend the weaker currency.
Potentially.
Yeah. So spend your Ethereum and other stuff that you may have in your portfolio.
Oh, let's talk about Ethereum.
But would you see a time in which not just Bitcoin, but let's say a stable coin being used for hotel transactions, anything on the blockchain?
Yeah. I mean, a blockchain is just a ledger. There's plenty of ledgers kind of out there. And in Japan in particular, people
Is there
like
a business case for let's just take the hospitality industry in which we're very familiar. Is there a business case for that? For accepting and, using transactions on chain?
I mean, yes and no. In Japan now, people are very familiar with using electronic money. So you can go to the hotel and you can tap your phone. Mm-hmm. In the States, you can use Apple Pay to settle transactions. I think for a consumer, what's most important is the speed of the transaction. And I did in the early days, try to pay for a coffee with Bitcoin, and you're standing there for 15 minutes waiting for the transaction to confirm. And, in its current form, it isn't a great money. It doesn't need to be a great money. It's a wonderful store of value. And there may be, applications that are built on Bitcoin in the future that enable these kind of micropayments. I know there are a few. I haven't used them. But as a company, as a hotel company or any business, to accept Bitcoin as payment is really clever, right? You can begin to grow your Bitcoin holdings over time. Don't sell it, keep it. It's a great way to start to diversify out of the cash that you're receiving. But most companies, they need that money that they've earned from revenue to pay expenses. And so if you're a hotel company, your margins are razor thin. That's why I'm so happy now that I'm out of the hospitality industry. But those razor thin margins don't really enable you to keep that revenue. Even if it came in Bitcoin, you'd have to sell it to pay expenses. But more and more companies, I think, around the world will begin to accept Bitcoin for payment. It'll be possible to transact purely in Bitcoin. Certainly in the Middle East now, you're seeing people use Bitcoin to purchase cars, they purchase apartments. And so the sellers are smart. They're like, I like this pristine capital.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to after COVID. So when Michael Saylor was talking about how he started this strategy, he was saying, how COVID hit and then the company was competing with other companies like Microsoft. What was your story like?
Well, at that time, I wish I had a more complicated story, to be honest. We were struggling a lot at that time. Our hotels were forcibly closed. And so we were in 4 markets, 3 in Southeast Asia and Japan. And 3 of those 4 markets, we were told that our hotel had to be closed. And so there was just, zero revenue and the expenses were still there. And so we were in that existential moment of how do we survive this? And our auditor had put this going concern footnote in our financials, which basically auditors do when you don't have enough cash to survive 12 months. And so it was really, it was a tough time. And inspired by the words of Michael Saylor, and I think I used a lot of the information that he had shared as ammo in my own kind of board meeting discussions, and people were very receptive. They said, let's convene a shareholder meeting and ask our shareholders. And so we went through the process of that. We announced that we'd have a shareholder meeting. We announced what the agenda items would be. We announced that we would be buying Bitcoin and making that our core treasury asset. And the market immediately responded. And so that made us feel more confident that that was the path to go down. And now we're only 13, 14 months into the story, and I'm feeling really excited and eager to continue with this pace of growth. And there's a very high hurdle and expectations now that are placed on us, but I'm up to the task.
How did the story go? So were you buying Bitcoin before this happened?
No.
And you just came across on YouTube, or how does that work?
Right. Well, you mean personally?
Well, you have to first believe in Bitcoin and this strategy to, proceed, right?
Yes.
How did that story go?
Sure. Well, I purchased Bitcoin actually early on, back in end of 2012, 2013 on Mt. Gox. I was living in Japan at that time. And that's how a lot of people who were kind of early buyers of Bitcoin first got their exposure. And so I suppose I've been a Bitcoiner for some time. It was something that kept me sane while I was part of the hotel business. And every time I wanted to cry because there was some issue in the hotel business, I could think about Bitcoin. And so, really looking for a path for many years on how I could bring my side passion together with business. And that opportunity presented itself at the depth of COVID.
I believe you said once, and I'm paraphrasing, that Bitcoin is a moral imperative. What do you mean by that?
I think I may have said it was sort of a moral obligation.
Yes.
Myself and others in the industry to help others discover Bitcoin. And so in Japan right now, if you discover Bitcoin, it's just not a really easy way to get exposure. Prior to Metaplanet, it wasn't an easy way to get exposure. The complexity in opening up an account. Japan increased its regulation significantly post Mt. Gox, which is a great thing and had to be done. But a lot of that regulation from those old days remains today. So it's not easy often to be involved in the digital asset space. And so we came about and we recognized that we wanted to provide exposure to Japanese investors that wanted to buy Bitcoin and found a way for them to achieve that in a very tax efficient manner. Now, beyond that, we have the license for Bitcoin Magazine in Japan. We launched our first edition back in March. The next one comes out at the end of June. And we're using that as our way to onboard Japanese people into Bitcoin. We feel that we have an obligation, a moral obligation to educate people on Bitcoin, help them with financial literacy. And so the Bitcoin Magazine is intended not to be a massive moneymaker, but really to be a tool for us to explain the story of Bitcoin. We also have our hotel. We sold everything except for one. And so the last remaining hotel is going to be rebranded as the Bitcoin Hotel. And again, that is our opportunity to onboard people in real life. People can come, they can experience the hotel, they can go to the Bitcoin Art Museum, and we'll be working with Bitcoin artists around the world that want to build on Bitcoin and have their art there, and we'll have a Bitcoin museum. People like to learn about the history of Bitcoin. There may be a Satoshi Nakamoto waxed figure kind of in the lobby that they can take photos with. And of course, would be honored if you guys would come and visit the hotel when we open at the beginning of next year.
How much orange will be used in the decor?
Good question. Is there too much orange? Is that possible?
I will ask the interior designers.
It sounds like Bitcoin conference every day.
Yeah.
At the hotel.
Yeah, except you sleep in the room. Simon, what's next for Metaplanet? You've adopted the strategy that has worked for you. You've turned the company around. Like Monty said, 600K Bitcoin premium. It's working. Any advancements to your strategy? Any expansion plans? Now that you have one hotel, do you plan to buy more hotels? No.
No. The reason we have the hotel is it's left over from the old days.
Yeah.
And so as we're keeping it, and there's a number of reasons why we want to maintain the hotel. The most important is that we have a lot of tax losses that are attached to the hotel. So as long as you keep it, you can use those tax losses and offset that against future gains from other businesses. So it's quite valuable for us to keep. But apart from the hotel, we are 100% a Bitcoin company now. And the brilliant thing about a Bitcoin treasury company, there's no need to really innovate. You have your core business, which is to buy Bitcoin. And where the innovation resides is in the ways that you raise capital. And so our primary form of capital raising now is the moving strike warrants, the at-the-money equity offering lookalike.
Yeah. Just to follow up, so what do you think of companies that use a hybrid strategy? So at one point, Elon Musk sold most of his Bitcoin for Tesla, but at one point, Tesla did hold Bitcoins on their treasury as well, for maybe different reasons than you. And obviously, their core business is not to be a Bitcoin treasury company. So should any company with core operations outside of a treasury holding company acquire Bitcoin to be held on their treasury as a cash alternative?
Absolutely. I think.
Why?
For the same reasons why we've discussed owning Bitcoin makes sense. I think we want to have not just cash sitting there, and cash sitting there is depreciating in value. I know some companies in Asia, they hold gold on their balance sheet, and Bitcoin, I think, is a much better version of gold. It's a digital gold. And so it should be in every CFO's treasure chest of things to select from.
Yes.
It shouldn't just be cash.
Can I have one last question? One last question. The producer said one.
One.
I was talking to an owner of an exchange from Asia the other day. So he said the US may have already won the Bitcoin war because everything is priced in USD stablecoins. Does that mean other countries are now too far behind?
I think adoption will take time. I also think that America is much smarter than people give it credit for. So I think Bitcoin is being purchased behind the scenes and just not being telegraphed. Right? If the US announces every single purchase that it makes, that would be working against it. Right? Price would go up a lot and they wouldn't be able to buy as much as they would like. But there are many nation states that are publicly disclosing that they're buying Bitcoin. El Salvador, I think, is a perfect example. Bhutan is doing the same. I know in the Middle East, there are many nations which are buying Bitcoin and they're announcing in different forms. And so I think there's room for many Bitcoin superpowers. The US definitely is the biggest and baddest superpower out there. But those that follow in due course, I think they can also be a Bitcoin superpower. And we want to, in Japan, kind of help Japan become that. Right now, it's through Metaplanet, and we're the largest holder of Bitcoin now, as a corporation in Japan and also in Asia. And we hope to do our part in inspiring Japan, perhaps to follow in the US's footsteps. So I wouldn't be too disappointed that you're not seeing it happen kind of everywhere. It all takes time, and you should be pleased that there is more time for you and I and others to buy Bitcoin before it becomes unaffordable.
I love that.
Well, let's make Bitcoin affordable for everybody. Thank you for disseminating your... That's not what I meant. I meant one day we'll all be rich enough to be buying as much Bitcoin as we want. That's the dream.
You have to tell all your friends and your family and those you care about that Bitcoin is now the time to buy.
This is why you're on the show, because you can give the message much better than I can. Thank you, Simon.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.